So we're back for the next part of the Cold War really ramping up here. 1950 is a year where if the Cold War is going to zip along, tension, 1950 it jumps to the next degree. There's a couple things that happen. First off is the Chinese Civil War comes to an end, and it does not end the way we wanted it to end. China, after the fall of the last emperor, had briefly become a republic under the leadership of a man named Sun Yat-sen. When Yat-sen, he winds up getting replaced by a military dictator. A communist faction begins to emerge. Ultimately, you wind up with a war between one Chiang Kai-shek, who is the leader of a nationalist government known as the Kuomintang, and Mao Zedong, the founder of Chinese communism. And Mao Zedong is, statistically speaking, the worst mass killer in history. If you count his engineered famines and stuff like that, 50 to 60 million people are dead by Mao's hand. So he's also the best-selling author of all time because he made it against the law not to own a copy of his book, the Little Red Book, or Quotations from Chairman Mao. So best-selling author and world's greatest mass murderer. He's got a very diversified resume, old Mao. So what transpires is a situation where Mao and Chiang's forces fight in a civil war from the middle of the 1920s until 1937, when Japan invades Manchuria and kicks off World War II in Asia. They then, remember, World War II was longer for them than it was for the Europeans, and certainly than it was for the Americans. We were only in it for 4 years. The Chinese were in it for 8. So you've got a period of 8 years where they had to put the Civil War on pause. And then after that, they immediately, as soon as Japan is beaten, they immediately resume hostilities. Well, by this time, Mao had gained the upper hand. The Soviets were starting to give him stuff. Chiang Kai-shek was certainly the lesser of two evils, but that didn't mean that he was a great leader. There was great corruption. There were times during World War II. Where I've heard it said, I can't remember where I heard this, but I've heard it said that they literally were charging artillery units for charging the cavalry to cover them. So a lot of corruption and graft. It was not a great government, so that turned people against it. Ultimately, the communists wind up taking control of China, and when all is said and done, the Communist Party wins the Chinese Civil War and gains control of the Chinese mainland. The original Chinese government, the one led by Chiang Kai-shek, actually flees to the island that we now know as Taiwan. At the time, people called it Formosa. But they flee to that island and set up what they call the Republic of China there. They continue to use that term. And the nation of Taiwan still believes that they are the legitimate owners of all China, but that they've been displaced by the illegitimate, tyranny. The communists who controlled the mainland, call themselves the People's Democratic Republic of China, which is, I always say, anytime you hear "people's" in a country's name, just assume it's really, really bad. And they claim that Taiwan belongs to them. And so the two of them don't get along at all. They both claim to be the one legitimate ruler of all China. Ultimately, the communists have been able to bully most of the world into accepting them as the legitimate ruler of all China. But, we don't even the United States does not officially recognize Taiwan. They kind of semi-official. But we've also promised to defend them in the event of war. I don't know if we'd still honor that commitment now or not, but certainly the idea for a long time. So anyway, this was a real shocking development because Americans had gotten a little bit invested in the results of the Chinese Civil War. We thought that Chiang would win, and we didn't want China to fall to communism. Now China is a communist country, and you've got geographically the two largest countries in the world, Russia and China, right next to each other. I mean, there may be, I don't know, maybe Canada's in there as far as geography is concerned, but I mean, this is, if you look at the map. I wish I had a world map, in my house that I could show you. But I mean, again, Russia and China right next to each other. That is a substantial part of the world falling under communism. And China falling to communism is really, really tragic because they're the most populous country in the world by a mile. Like 1 out of 6 people in the world lives there. 1 out of 6. So when the communists took that over, I mean, that was a huge blow for the cause of freedom. Not that Sheng was the world's perfect democracy, but at the same time, he was certainly better than what Mao had to offer, which is tens of millions of people dying, and to this day, the Chinese regime is that followed Mao is just one of the most wicked governments on the earth, largely responsible through their unwillingness to share stuff for what's going on right now. If they had not tried to cover their tracks on some of this stuff, things would be a lot different. But also, kind of genocidal things against the Chinese Muslims in the East that they call the Uyghurs. Just all kinds of terrible things that the Chinese do. Persecute Christians. The one-child policy, which forced families to have abortions on any child more than one for several decades. So, I mean, just horrible, horrible government. So that's shock number one. We don't like that. And this was a big thing politically, too, because there's a handful of people that kind of thought that we should have done something militarily to aid the Republic of China. And I just don't know if that was militarily feasible. But it certainly was a powerful argument at the time because you just watched, again, 1/6 of the world's population fall under communist tyranny. But that was just practice for the second major development that shows up, which is the discovery that the Soviet Union has broken the American nuclear monopoly. We were terrified by the existence of the atomic bomb, even though we were the only ones that had it. But we also knew that part of the reason why the Russians didn't pick a fight with us in Berlin, in the whole Berlin airlift crisis, part of the reason why they didn't invade Turkey when we started giving them money, part of the reason why they didn't invade Greece when we started aiding the Greek government, part of the reason why they left Iran, in exchange for after some tough diplomacy. Part of the reason for all of that was because the Russians knew that we, the Americans, had a bomb that no one else had that could destroy an entire city at once. We were the only country that had a bomb that was the equivalent of thousands of tons of TNT. Until 1950. And guess what? Now the bad guys have it too. The communist government, the one that's throwing everyone in the gulag, the one that's founding a secret police, the one that's taking children out of their homes to like indoctrinate them to the state and teach them to snitch on their parents if they talk bad about the government so they can take their parents and throw them in prison. The ones that starved the peasants to death in order to gain control over the agricultural system. That government, the government that invaded Poland alongside Hitler, that signed the non-aggression pact with Germany, that lied about bringing free elections to a half a dozen countries that they were militarily occupying. That country now has nuclear weapons. This is not good. Joseph Stalin has access now to a bomb that's the equivalent of thousands of tons of TNT. And you better bet that this is a shocking development in America's psyche. Go back and watch any entertainment from the 50s that's willing to kind of venture there. Obviously, a lot of the stuff in the 50s was this kind of I Love Lucy, The World's Perfect, and the whole thing. Leave It to Beaver and all that. But anything that kind of touches political things, you notice there's this really deep paranoia. There's this real sense that the communists really could come take over at any time. I'm sure you remember well from last year when we watched it. I'll send you the link again of the duck and cover videos. Like you all remember that where kids were having to duck anywhere because the bomb was about to go off, and of course it was a little overwrought and ridiculous as far as thinking that certain things were going to be helpful. But think about that. You're a school kid for a generation from 1950 really all the way on, for another couple decades. You're taught, you have atomic bomb drills in school. Like, it's just a thing that you prepare for, that at any given time, the Russians, who with their crazy leaders, who are dictators, who don't like to take no for an answer, and have no conscience at all, are willing to press a button and nuclear fury rains down from the sky. Really our best defense on paper is doing the same thing to them. Which we kind of have some ambivalence about because we don't want to see nuclear, nuclear bombs, no fun for anybody. But we would have had to in that situation. So the threat and the specter of nuclear war is going to hang over the 1950s, the 1960s, even parts of the 1970s. We move into the era that they call détente, where the Cold War kind of chills a little bit. But it was a real threat, and it was a real threat. Even in the 80s, by then we kind of figured we're not really going to have nuclear war with the Soviets, but there was still a let's put it this way, there was a non-zero chance. It was a chance that was greater than zero that was going to happen. But the 50s and 60s, it's palpable and it's real all the time. And it's going to drive some people mad. Like, people get so paranoid. We'll talk about this more in the next video. People get so paranoid. There's this one group called the John Birch Society that is basically exists to accuse people of being communist, and thinks that Dwight D. Eisenhower was a secret communist agent. Just people go insane. But a lot of the fears, not that. The fears that Dwight D. Eisenhower is a communist. If you actually think that, you're an idiot. But the fears that the communists had infiltrated high parts of the government, well, they had. We'll talk about that more next video. The fears that something could go wrong, we could go to war. Very real scenario. So again, I cannot get across to you enough just how shocking it is to discover the Soviets have the bomb. We come to find out the Soviets have the bomb because of a highly sophisticated intelligence apparatus that in particular was spying on us a little bit, especially on the Brits, because the British were trying to develop nukes as well. And anyway, we'll talk about the espionage stuff in the next video when we talk about the Red Scare and what was right and not right about it, because there was a lot that was right. Some of it was insane. But anyway, it winds up being a very intensive Soviet spy network is responsible for them gaining the nuclear secrets, which is part of what fuels that paranoia. The other thing about 1950 is America goes to war again. We're only 5 years removed from the end of World War II, and it probably hasn't really gotten to feel like peacetime just yet either, because we've got all these constant crises that President Truman's always having to kind of navigate. Come 1950, we're going to get pulled into a war in Asia. Not originally against China, but guess what? It is actually going to wind up being against China before it's all over. So the island nation of Korea, or not island, excuse me, peninsula, the peninsular nation of Korea, it had been passed between Chinese and Japanese imperialists for a certain period of time. So I get a little bit shorter here because I'm tired of being in my shoes. Okay, so uh, so the Korean Peninsula had been occupied in the north by communists, in the south by the democracies, particularly America. When the war's over, they hold the elections in the north. The communists win 90%. You know how that is. And they actually put in a guy by the name of the North Korean dictator is a fellow by the name of Kim Il Sung. If that seems a little familiar to you, it's because Kim Il Sung is the grandfather of Kim Jong Un, the current craziest man in the world. Kim Jong Un, the current leader of North Korea, is so vicious and so cruel that he literally fed his uncle to the dogs. Like, he literally had fed his uncle to a pack of dogs as punishment for something he did he didn't like. Just very murderous, insane guy. Also looks a lot like the token fat character in, like, you know how there's like that like genre of like movies from like the 80s and 90s where it's like groups of kids go on adventures and there's always like one token fat kid, who's always like messing up all the time. Kim Jong Un looks like that guy. It's true. So why, so North Korea winds up kind of functioning as a sort of a pseudo monarchy where they actually kind of pass the leadership down from Kim Il Sung to Kim Jong Il to Kim Jong Un. But so Kim Il Sung becomes the leader of North Korea. The South Koreans wind up under the leadership of a man by the name of Syngman Rhee. Now, it's a little bit false to say that South Korea in the 1950s was a democracy. They do evolve into a democracy over time. In the 50s, they were still a little bit of an authoritarian government. They were still a little bit of a dictatorship, but they were a lot less harsh of a dictatorship than Kim was going to provide. They were a lot more sympathetic to the democratic countries, and a little bit more in terms of certain rights, although they didn't have great free speech records and things like that necessarily all the time. So, but Syngman Rhee, clearly the lesser of the two evils here. So, Kim Il Sung decides to lead his North Korean troops in an invasion of South Korea. And this is kind of the first time since the whole Cold War settlement had been established, since this whole way the world is working has happened. This is really the first time where one country just straight up invades the other. So we've got to know, how do we respond? Now, obviously, we had the pact with NATO. It had this happen in Western Europe. I don't know if SEATO had been formed yet. No, it hadn't. So we had not yet formed SEATO, which was the alliance of similar in Asia. But we still thought it was important. We still thought it was important that we needed to lay the hammer down that we're not going to allow relatively free countries to start getting gobbled up by communist countries. And we're not going to, and the Soviets were encouraging of the North Koreans. There were not Soviet troops firing guns in the Korean War, although there were Soviet officials who were going over as military advisors and kind of covert operations type things, but they didn't actually have like units. However, the Soviets, all the North Koreans were using Soviet-made guns. They were oftentimes being trained by Soviet intelligence. So they were a part of it. So Truman makes an interesting decision. And I'm generally a Harry Truman fan, even though I don't say that about many Democrats, to be honest. But I like Truman. But although some of the worst things we would have done in domestic policy, he didn't happen because the Senate was Republican or whatever. And, if he'd had a Democratic Senate, I might be saying a different tune. But it worked out okay. But he was good on foreign policy, in my opinion, with the one exception. One exception is that he did something that has never gone back, which is he broke the tradition of following the constitutional structure of asking Congress for a declaration of war to go to Korea. So this is the beginning of never actually getting a declaration of war. We have not declared war on another country since we declared war on Japan, Germany, and Italy in 1941. Now, since then, we fought Korea, we fought Vietnam, we fought the first Iraq War that was in Kuwait, Desert Storm, the second Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. That's 5 real major engagements, and that's not getting into the fact that we've had troops in Bosnia, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Panama, Grenada. We've been around. We've been in all those conflicts since 1945 and have not declared war legally. Now, I think that's a problem because the constitutional structure was set up to where Congress had to issue the declaration of war, and then the president carries it out. Instead, following this precedent that Truman started, the president acts pretty unilaterally in foreign affairs. Congress did some stuff to try to pull back and require some more congressional oversight, like the War Powers Act that passed in the 1970s in response to Nixon's invasion of Cambodia during the Vietnam War. But nonetheless, the president has definitely taken the lead in foreign policy ever since. But something that Truman does that's interesting was while he doesn't go to Congress, he does actually go to the United Nations and for the first time appeals to the United Nations Security Council to send UN troops to fight back the North Korean invasion. Now, normally this would never work because the UN Security Council, the Soviet Union, was one of the 5 countries that have a permanent veto. But the Soviets made a really bad diplomatic blunder from their perspective. They were upset about something that happened in the UN, and their response was to boycott the UN. So they gave up their seat temporarily and just didn't send a person to go represent them there. And while that's happening, the Security Council makes the motion to agree to send the troops of the world against North Korea, as many, to call on countries to send troops. They can't make them send people, but they issued, the call to all these countries. And the Soviets were not there to vote no, so with them not being present, the Security Council votes yes, and for the first time, the United Nations commits troops to war. The leadership, though, was going to fall heavily on the United States. However, other countries came with us. There were British with us. Australians were with us. There was a whole bunch of different places. But the Americans made up the bulk of the troops and a lot of the money as well. Now, the leadership of the Army at this point belongs to General Douglas MacArthur, who had been the senior commander during the Japanese War. He had had a very busy time between the wars because we didn't really have time to allude to this in the previous video, but what happened when Japan signed their surrender, we actually kind of installed General MacArthur as the imperial governor, so to speak. Imperial was not, we wouldn't have used that word, but that's functionally what it was. But as the occupation governor of Japan, and we basically said Japan is going to be given their independence back at a certain period of time, but in the meantime, MacArthur is going to kind of run things and start preparing a way to democratize Japan. And Japan winds up adopting a system similar to ours or the Western European nations, and Japan actually becomes a functioning democracy and becomes a very successful one. And MacArthur, who you would have expected to become a hated figure in Japan, because he was behind the army, actually winds up being more popular than you would have thought. He kind of helps get Japan prepared for democracy. And American culture makes a big impact on the years of American occupation actually impact Japanese culture fairly significantly. So, MacArthur has basically gotten to rule Japan for a few years after the war, which I'm sure suited his ego well, because his ego was massive. Like the man, Douglas MacArthur loves himself some Douglas MacArthur now. No, don't be fooled about it. But he is given command of the troops in Korea, but by the time that the war is on, and the Korean War is kind of the forgotten war, it wasn't quite as it was a little controversial, but it wasn't as controversial as Vietnam. It was it's not the same kind of fighting as Vietnam. I think some people have a misconception that Korea was like Vietnam. They're actually nothing alike. Korea was much more like World War II. It was armies on battlefields, paratroopers, amphibious invasions, and then it's not a guerrilla warfare situation. And then also the conditions and the temperature and stuff is really different. Like Japan, Vietnam, it's like really hot, it's muggy, it's raining all the time. Korea is different. Like in Korea, it's like freezing. Like in Korea, they're dealing with bitter cold as part of the problem. So the geography is very different. The style of war is more like World War II. So when we get in, I really wish that I could do this where I had my whiteboard where I could like draw a little Korea and show you the way that the lines of the battle map move, because there's not really a good illustration in your book that I can see, and that's a mistake. Your book's really good most of the time, but I wish they had a picture of exactly what the battle lines look like in Korea, because when we get involved in the war, South Korea is in bad shape. South Korea is desperately holding on to something that they call the Pusan Perimeter, which was basically a line running through the coastal city of Pusan. So, and when I say, so Korea is a peninsula, so it's surrounded on water on three sides. Pusan is on the southern coast, which means that North Korea has functionally, by the time the American troops get there, North Korea has functionally overrun South Korea. The city of Pusan and the countries that are parallel to it are like the last holdouts. So let's say that North Korea has taken over maybe 4/5 of Korea, going north to south, right? So that's the situation when we get involved. The thing that really turns things around is MacArthur was a pretty good general, but this was his greatest moment. This is his moment of just sheer brilliance. What they call the Incheon invasion. So Incheon was a port city in South Korea, and again, I really wish I had some kind of visual aid to show you the battle map here. But so you've got, here's the Pusan perimeter. We said, you know what? Let's take advantage of it being a peninsula by attacking them somewhere up here by sea. And the idea was, okay, so if North Korea is here and South Korea is here, well, as the North Koreans stream to the south, they're getting further and further away from their supply lines. So we said, what if we took advantage of the peninsula by landing troops not here where we were defending things, but moving around them and try to cut them off from their reinforcements, leave some of the North Korean troops stranded, and kind of push back that way. And so we look at several different places, because one thing, peninsulas are a little bit vulnerable to invasion because you can land your boats anywhere. There's only one landlocked region in a peninsula. But Incheon was a weird choice in some ways because it was a very, very dangerous mission. We launched, this was what they call a triamphibious invasion, meaning we were invading by land, air, and sea. So some people were paratrooping in, were parachuting in. There were paratroopers that were dropping from airplanes on parachutes. That's the air. Some were, invading by sea, and then some were coming, from pre-established bases by land. So we've got like a couple different dimensions that the invasion's taking place at. But the the place that we had kind of selected to launch the invasion force, there's a really significant coral reef, and the you had to time the invasion perfect with the tide, because if you caught it at low tide, you were going to get our entire force hung up on the reef and functionally paralyzed, stuck in the waters, and may have eventually crashed in waves. It would have been a bad deal. The genius of it was that because the North Koreans knew that, Incheon was the place where they had not devoted hardly any defense to, because they thought, no one's gonna invade there. You know, it would be suicide. But we did, and we did it just right, and we did it in such a way that it wound up being a major thing that turns the tide of the war. And so now we cut this North Korean troop off. You know, we regain control of all of South Korea, and then MacArthur starts pushing into North Korea, and we kind of start to think, you know what, while we're here, why don't we just take out the North Korean regime? Well, so the idea, we actually move up into, past South Korea, we actually move into North Korea. You know, we're trying to push invade, and we think that we could take out the North Korean regime, put the whole country under the South Korean government, and, you know, free Korea from communism. That's how it's looking. But we overplayed our hand a little bit, because what happens next is the communist government in China starts sending troops. And they send a lot of troops, because they've got a lot of troops to send. Officially, China never declared war on us. In fact, officially, they never sent troops. Officially, all the troops were volunteers. Everybody knows that's bogus. I mean, everybody. I don't even know if the Chinese even pretended anymore. We did not formally declare war on China because we just didn't want to. We just didn't want to do all that. At this point, the Chinese come in. They start launching what they call human wave attacks, which basically meant there was not a ton of strategy and gamesmanship in terms of troop placement. It was just sending people. And so the Chinese took pretty heavy casualties, but they got us in some trouble. And now, all of a sudden, the Chinese involvement into the war has not only pushed us out of North Korea, it's jeopardized our gains in South Korea, and it looks like things are starting to get pushed back in the opposite direction. And it is about that time, well, and I should say, too, you might want to look at page 517. There's a pretty long sidebar on what they call Frozen Chosin, which was based on probably the most infamous engagement of the Korean War, was the Battle for Chosin in the north, which happens at a time after the Chinese get involved, which is a time where they're literally fighting at times in sub-zero temperatures. Can you imagine it being below zero outside, and you're outside with a gun in your hand getting shot at? That ain't fun. And so Chosin was a major battle that involved, I believe it was a U.S. Marine unit, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, U.S. Marines 1st Division. It was right near the Yalu River, which is the region where the Chinese troops were starting to stream in. Ultimately, they had to do a kind of strategic withdrawal. It was kind of a big deal. The Marines lost 13,000 men, but the Chinese lost 37,000. So that was a particularly nasty engagement. Lots of people wound up winning medals of honor there. But the Chinese presence changes the equation in the war. Well, this is where MacArthur and Truman come to a misunderstanding. MacArthur, he's a complicated man. Part of me loves him. Part of me just wants to faceplant with MacArthur sometimes. But MacArthur kind of all by his lonesome kind of hatches this plan where to fight fire with fire, since the Chinese communists have gotten involved, we need to bring Taiwan into the war. And we need to, while we're at it, take this time to overthrow not just North Korea, but the communist regime in Beijing and reinstall Chiang Kai-shek as the leader of all China. Now, this would be great if we could do it, but the reality is that's a very tall order. And so MacArthur kind of comes up with this plan. At some point, he and Truman discuss it, and Truman says, absolutely not, you're insane. And the reason he says that is because, from his perspective, bringing Taiwan into the war, or actually invading, because MacArthur literally said we should actually invade China, send troops to China itself. He said, man, if you do that, there's a 100% chance that the Russians are going to get involved on the side of the Chinese. Then we've got the Soviet and the Chinese Communist Party fighting together against us. You've got World War III on our hands, only now the Soviets have the atomic bomb too. Now, one thing that's interesting about the Korean War is that it's the first war that we went into after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we never used nuclear weapons. And a lot of commanders in the Army were frustrated with this at times. That we weren't more willing to at least threaten it. But the idea was we really wanted to establish the precedent that nuclear weapons are a last resort. We did not want to just start dropping nukes because the battle was going bad. First off, it wouldn't have been a good fit for the objective of the Korean War anyway, because we're trying to rescue South Korea. If we drop a bomb on part of South Korea, you're going to kill a lot of the people that you're there to save. So that was a part of it. But we also just wanted to discourage the idea of using nuclear weapons as regular weapons. And a lot of military commanders were very frustrated with President Truman about that, because they said, we've got this super bomb, why don't we use it? But Truman kind of understood what he had unleashed at Hiroshima, and he didn't want to just go do that flippantly. So ultimately, Truman tells MacArthur, no, that's stupid. We're not invading China. We're not getting the Taiwanese involved in this. Well, MacArthur does not like this at all. And he becomes openly insubordinate. Trashes the president by name in pretty harsh terms in an interview with a reporter. And for that, Truman actually winds up firing Douglas MacArthur. So Douglas MacArthur, Medal of Honor winner, hero of World War II, former governor of Japan, the mastermind of the Inchon invasion, out. And, when I was in college, I did a research paper, actually, on the topic of Truman and MacArthur's feud. And I went in fully expecting to argue in favor of MacArthur, because I really like Douglas MacArthur. I know I maybe don't sound like that to you right now, but it's just, he's a complicated guy. But I really am an admirer of parts of his life. So I wanted to, I just assumed I was going to side with MacArthur. And then once I started studying the data and the logistics and the reality of what would have happened if we had invaded China, there's no way we could have done it. It just, there's a part of me that says, man, wouldn't it have been great if we could have done that and gotten the Chinese, liberated in the 50s. But at the same time, like I said, we wouldn't be here because all of our parents would have died. It would have been terrible. The bloodbath, the nuclear weapons would have come out if the Russians had gotten involved. It would have been mutually assured destruction. The world did not need, an invasion of China on our part in 1953. With that, Truman actually was, because MacArthur basically refused to go along with orders. I mean, remember, the president is the commander-in-chief of the army, which means that he outranks any general at any given time. Because MacArthur is just in open defiance and kind of refusing to go along with what he wanted, MacArthur gets the boot. MacArthur goes on to speak against him more in the media as a private citizen. He talks about how there's, quote, no substitute for victory, meaning he's kind of begins to accuse Truman of not really doing everything he can to win the war, which sort of true because there were things that we were holding back on because we didn't want it to escalate. We were not trying to mobilize a total war in World War II. We were not trying to create a Korean War where we had so many troops over here that we have to start rationing food back home and selling war bonds. And we didn't want to do that whole thing again. So we are kind of rationing our troop levels. We are refusing to use nuclear weapons. We are, not trying to make the political situation go insane by, adding a Taiwan-China dynamic to it. But at the same time, I think in hindsight, now that we did get, to, 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union without there having been a shooting war, I tend to look back and say it's moments like that where it really could have happened that it was very wise on the part. I gotta to tell me my battery's running low. So I guess I better make this brief now. But it was about to be over anyway. But I really think it was probably wisdom on Truman's part not to allow the Korean War to escalate into something more than it was. MacArthur ultimately is replaced by a new commander by the name of Matthew B. Ridgway. The war continues until 1953. In 1953, in the middle of that year, they actually finish peace talks that have been going on for some time. Part of this is due to a change in administration. In 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower runs as the Republican nominee for president, and Truman didn't run for re-election that time. He had won re-election already in 48, which is the famous Dewey defeats Truman. You've maybe seen that picture where the newspaper reported the wrong election result, and then it turned out to have been wrong. But Truman stepped out. Eisenhower won the election against a fellow named Adlai Stevenson. We'll go back and look at politics more in the near future. But Eisenhower, we come to find out now, nobody knew this at the time. There's some declassified stuff that's come out in recent years that it turns out that Eisenhower basically went to the North Koreans and threatened to end the use of, to end the hesitancy of using nuclear weapons if they would not negotiate. So actually the nuclear threat did actually help bring a peace settlement. So North Korea and South Korea sign a ceasefire, but not a formal peace treaty. And to this day, they divide, they kept the division along the 38th parallel. And ever since then, there's like a demilitarized zone on either side of the parallels. And then as soon as it's legally able, both sides have watchtowers with big barbed wire fences and machine guns pointing at each other. And it's been kind of a constant stare down on the North Korea-South Korea border ever since 1953. It's still that way. The new South Korean president is a little more friendly to the North, so that maybe started to change a little. But anyway, it's been a state of high tension in Korea ever since then. Some people kind of say that Korea is a little bit less than a full victory. It's a little bit of a stalemate. I know of at least one book that was written called Korea, the First War We Lost. I don't think it's fair to say we lost the Korean War, because if you look at what was the mission when we started the Korean War, protect South Korea from communist invasion. Well, we accomplished that. So, we won the war in that sense. We restored things to the way it was. Why it maybe felt like a little bit of a loss to some people is that along the way we started to kind of daydream about taking out the North Koreans or taking out the communist Chinese, if you're MacArthur. And we fell short of that. But we actually accomplished what we set out to do, when all was said and done. And South Korea goes on to become a very prosperous country. They're a very modern country. They're not, if you have in your head some sort of idea of kind of a stereotypical like backwater Asian country, that's not South Korea. South Korea is one of the most high-tech industrialized countries in the world. Some of Seoul, South Korea, I think might be the biggest city in the whole world, if I'm not mistaken. It's either Seoul or Tokyo. South Korea, incidentally, was one of the first Asian countries to really Christianize. I think they were the first Asian country to ever have a Protestant majority, or plurality. I don't know if they were over 50%. They were the largest religion. So South Korea is in South Korea. You probably know some South Korean brand names in the electronics industry and some different things. So they wound up actually doing very well for themselves. North Korea, on the other hand, did not. North Korea is probably one of the worst places on earth. Along with, I mean, you could say the Sudan and a couple other places, but they're one of the 2 or 3 worst places in the world. Mass starvation, deep repression, cult of personality around the ruler, no individual freedom. They say, okay, so the North and South Koreans are, ethnically, genetically the same people group, basically. The average height of a South Korean has shot up over that of the average North Korean just because of generations of starvation. North Korea is really struggling, and a very, very terrible government. And hopefully we'll see change there at some point in the future. All right, so that's the Korean War. When we come back, we will start looking as the Cold War is about to start blowing up in other places, Cuba, Vietnam, all over the place. So see you next time. Same bat time, same bat channel.